The wind was biting cold that evening, sweeping through the bustling city streets as people hurried past, their faces buried in scarves and their minds focused on getting home. Among the crowd, unnoticed by most, sat a man on a tattered blanket. His name was Jack, and for as long as he could remember, the streets had been his home. He didn't beg for money or pity. He simply sat with his small cardboard sign that read, "Have a nice day." Jack wasn't like most people might imagine a homeless man to be. He had a warm smile, a quick wit, and a knack for noticing the little things others often overlooked. Tonight, though, his smile was faint, worn down by hunger and the sharp ache in his legs from sitting too long on the cold pavement. Still, he greeted every passerby with a nod or a cheerful evening, even if they didn't look his way. As the evening stretched on, the streets grew quieter, and Jack's hope for a warm meal dwindled. Just as he was about to pack up his things and retreat to the alley he called home, he spotted a man standing a few feet away. The man looked out of place, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed money, but with a look of discomfort on his face, as if he didn't quite belong in this part of town. He clutched a sleek leather briefcase in one hand and a phone in the other, his brows furrowed in frustration. Jack watched him for a moment, curious. The man seemed lost or maybe just overwhelmed. After a few seconds, Jack stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands, and approached cautiously. "You all right there, buddy?" he asked, his voice kind but wary. The man looked up, startled. His eyes, sharp and calculating, softened when they met Jack's. Yeah. I think I took a wrong turn. My car's parked somewhere nearby, but I can't seem to find it." Jack chuckled, a warm sound that cut through the cold air. "This city's like a maze if you're not used to it. Where'd you park? I might be able to point you in the right direction." The man hesitated, glancing at Jack's worn clothes and weathered face. But something about Jack's genuine smile made him relax. "It's in a lot near a cafe. I think it's called, Maple Bean?" Jack's face lit up. "Oh, I know that place. It's just a few blocks down. I can show you if you'd like." The man hesitated again, clearly torn. But then he nodded. "That'd be great, actually. Thank you." As they walked together through the quiet streets, they talked. The man introduced himself as Richard, though he didn't offer a last name. Jack didn't press. He shared little snippets of his life, carefully leaving out the harsher details, while Richard listened with a mix of curiosity and unease. When they finally reached the parking lot, Richard turned to Jack. "Thank you." "Jack, was it?" Jack nodded, smiling. "That's me." "Glad I could help." Richard opened his car door, then paused. He glanced back at Jack, his expression unreadable. "Do you, need a ride somewhere?" Jack laughed softly. "Nah, I'm good. This is my neighborhood. But thanks for the offer." Richard nodded, still lingering as if he wanted to say more. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. "Here. For your help." Jack looked at the bill, then back at Richard, his smile fading. "I didn't do it for money, you know." "I know," Richard said quietly. "But take it anyway. Get yourself something warm to eat." Jack hesitated, then took the bill with a nod of gratitude. "Thanks, Richard. Take care of yourself." As Richard drove away, Jack stood there for a moment, watching the taillights disappear into the night. He felt the weight of the bill in his hand and thought about the meal it would buy. But more than that, he thought about the man who had given it to him the way he had looked at Jack, not with pity, but with something else. What Jack didn't know, as he walked back to his corner of the world, was that this simple act of kindness would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. And as for Richard? Well, he wasn't just any man. He was someone who could make those changes happen if he chose to. The night after meeting Richard, Jack sat under the flickering streetlight near the alley he called home. The $100 bill still rested in his pocket, a strange weight he couldn't quite ignore. He had planned to use it for a hot meal, maybe even a night at a cheap motel to escape the cold, but something stopped him. It wasn't just the money, it was the man who gave it to him. There was something different about Richard, something Jack couldn't put his finger on. He wasn't like the others who occasionally tossed spare change or handed out leftover food. Richard's eyes had carried a mix of emotions, curiosity, sadness, maybe even guilt. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter wasn't the end of the story. As the city began to stir the next morning, Jack made his way to the cafe Richard had mentioned. It wasn't a place he usually visited. The crowd there was different, the kind of people who wore expensive coats and carried laptops. Jack lingered outside, watching through the window as customers sipped their coffee and typed away on their screens. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe a glimpse of Richard, maybe something else entirely. A barista stepped outside to take out the trash and noticed Jack standing there. She was young, with bright eyes and a kind smile. "Hey," she said softly. "Can I get you something? Coffee? A muffin?" Jack hesitated, then shook his head. "Thanks, but I'm just passing through." The barista nodded, her smile never fading. "Well, if you change your mind, just come in. First cup's on me." Jack thanked her and walked away, but her kindness stayed with him. It reminded him of how Richard had treated him not as a problem to solve, but as a person. As the day wore on, Jack found himself thinking more about his own life. He hadn't always lived on the streets. Once upon a time, he had a job, a small apartment, and even dreams of something more. But life had a way of unraveling, one thread at a time. A layoff, a few bad decisions, and before he knew it, he was here, invisible to most of the world. That evening, as Jack returned to his usual spot, he noticed something strange. A sleek black car was parked across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. It wasn't unusual for cars to come and go, but this one didn't move. Hours passed, and it stayed there, silent and still. Jack tried to ignore it, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stood up and crossed the street, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. As he approached the car, the driver's side window rolled down just enough for him to see a pair of sharp eyes staring back at him. "Jack," the voice said, low and measured. Jack froze. "Do I know you?" The man in the car didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, holding it out through the window. "Take this." Jack hesitated. "What is it?" "Just take it," the man said. "You'll understand soon enough." Against his better judgment, Jack took the envelope. Before he could say another word, the window rolled up, and the car sped off into the night. Back in his alley, Jack opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address scrawled on it in neat handwriting. Beneath the address were 2 words, "Be there." Jack stared at the note, his mind racing. Who was this man? How did he know Jack's name? And what was waiting for him at that address? The next morning, Jack set out to find the address. It led him to a part of the city he rarely visited, a neighborhood filled with towering buildings and immaculate streets. The address pointed to a high-rise with a doorman who looked at Jack with thinly veiled suspicion. "I'm here to see someone," Jack said, holding up the note. The doorman frowned but picked up the phone. After a brief conversation, he nodded and gestured for Jack to enter. "Penthouse," he said curtly. Jack stepped into the elevator, his heart pounding as it climbed higher and higher. When the doors finally opened, he found himself in a sprawling apartment that seemed to stretch on forever. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, and the air smelled faintly of leather and fresh flowers. "Jack?" a familiar voice said. Jack turned to see Richard standing by a grand piano, dressed casually this time in a sweater and jeans. "You?" Jack said, his voice a mix of surprise and confusion. "What's going on? Why am I here?" Richard smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I wanted to thank you for helping me the other night." Jack frowned. "You already did. The $100, remember?" "That was just a start," Richard said, his tone serious now. "I've been thinking about you, Jack. About how we met and about the kind of person you are. And I think there's more to your story than what I saw that night." Jack didn't know what to say. He felt out of place in this luxurious space, like an intruder in someone else's world. "I want to help you," Richard continued. "But first, I need to know more. About you, your life, how you ended up where you are." Jack hesitated. He didn't like talking about his past. It was messy and painful, filled with regrets he'd rather forget. But something about Richard's earnest expression made him consider it. "Why do you care?" Jack asked finally. Richard's gaze softened. "Because I've been where you are, Jack. Not on the streets, but close. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to think no one cares. Someone helped me once, and it changed everything. Now I want to do the same for you." Jack stared at him, unsure whether to believe him. But deep down, a small part of him wanted to trust Richard, to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life could change too. And so, Jack began to tell his story. Jack's voice was hesitant at first, the words coming out in uneven fragments as he tried to explain how his life had unraveled. Richard listened intently, his expression unreadable, but his focus unwavering. Jack spoke of the good years, when he had a steady job as a mechanic and a small apartment he was proud of. He talked about how he used to fix up old cars on weekends, dreaming of one day owning his own garage. But then came the downturn. The shop he worked for closed, and jobs were scarce. He'd taken a few bad loans to make ends meet, and when the bills piled up faster than he could pay them, the bank came for his apartment. Jack described the moment he realized he had nowhere to go, the shame of sleeping in his car, until even that was repossessed. By the time Jack finished, the room felt heavy with the weight of his story. Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he processed everything Jack had said. "You've been through a lot," Richard said finally. Jack shrugged, trying to play it off. "I'm not the only one. Plenty of people out there have it worse." Richard shook his head. "That doesn't make your struggle any less real." He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the city below. "You know, I didn't grow up with money either," he said after a moment. "My family scraped by, and there were times we didn't know if we'd make rent. But I got lucky. Someone gave me a shot when I needed it most." Jack tilted his head, curious. What kind of shot? Richard turned back to face him, his eyes intense. An opportunity. They saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. And they took a risk. Jack frowned, unsure where this was going. "And now you're a billionaire?" Richard smiled faintly. "Something like that. But money doesn't fix everything, Jack. It just gives you options." He paused as if weighing his next words carefully. "And I think you deserve some options too." Before Jack could respond, Richard's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and his expression darkened. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, picking up the phone and stepping into another room. Jack sat there, feeling out of place in the luxurious penthouse. He glanced around, his eyes landing on a framed photo on a nearby shelf. It showed Richard with a woman and a young boy, all smiling brightly. The sight tugged at something deep in Jack, a reminder of the family he hadn't seen in years. Richard's voice, muffled but sharp, carried through the partially closed door. Jack couldn't make out the words, but the tone was tense. After a few minutes, Richard returned, his face drawn. "Everything okay?" Jack asked cautiously. Richard nodded, though the crease in his brow remained. "Just business," he said, brushing it off. But Jack could tell it was more than that. Richard sat down again, his demeanor shifting back to the calm, composed man Jack had first met. "Jack, I have an idea. It's a bit unconventional, but I think it could work." Jack raised an eyebrow. "What kind of idea?" "I want to invest in you," Richard said simply. "Not just money, but time, resources, whatever it takes to help you get back on your feet." Jack blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "Why would you do that?" "You don't even know me." Richard leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Because I believe in second chances. And because I think you've got more potential than you realize." Jack didn't know what to say. The offer sounded too good to be true, and part of him wondered if there was some kind of catch. But another part of him, the part that hadn't dared to hope in years, wanted to believe it was real. Before Jack could respond, Richard's phone buzzed again. This time, he ignored it. "Think about it," Richard said. "You don't have to decide right now. But if you're willing to take a chance, I promise you won't regret it." Jack nodded slowly, his mind racing. "All right, I'll think about it." As Jack left the penthouse that night, the city felt different somehow. The streets were the same, the cold just as biting, but there was a spark of something he hadn't felt in years possibility. But as he walked back to his usual spot, he noticed something strange. The black car from the previous night was parked near his alley again. This time, the driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, with a sharp suit and an air of authority. "Jack," the man said, his tone clipped. Jack froze. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he handed Jack another envelope. "This is for your eyes only," he said. "Read it carefully." Before Jack could ask any questions, the man got back in the car and drove off, leaving Jack standing there with the envelope in his hand. Back in his alley, Jack opened it to find a single sheet of paper. The message was short but chilling. "Be careful who you trust." Jack's heart pounded as he read the words over and over. Who had sent this? And why? For the first time in years, Jack felt a surge of fear, not for his safety, but for the uncertainty of what he'd just stepped into. As the night deepened, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen. Jack stared at the note, his mind spinning. The words "be careful who you trust" felt like a warning, but from whom? And why? He glanced around the dimly lit alley, half expecting the mysterious man or his car to reappear. But the street was empty, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic. He folded the note and shoved it deep into his pocket, his thoughts racing. Was this about Richard? Could the man who had shown him nothing but kindness have some hidden agenda? Or was someone else watching, someone who knew more than they were letting on? The next morning, Jack decided to confront his unease head-on. He returned to the cafe near Richard's penthouse, hoping to clear his mind with a cup of coffee and maybe catch another glimpse of the barista who had been kind to him. As he sipped the steaming drink she handed him with a smile, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Across the street, a man in a gray coat lingered near a newsstand, pretending to read a paper but glancing in Jack's direction every few seconds. Jack's stomach tightened. He wasn't imagining it someone was following him. Jack finished his coffee quickly and stepped outside, walking briskly down the street. He glanced over his shoulder, and sure enough, the man in the gray coat was trailing him, keeping just enough distance to avoid suspicion. Jack ducked into an alley, his heart pounding. He crouched behind a dumpster, waiting to see if the man would follow. A moment later, footsteps echoed off the walls, growing louder with each step. "Jack!" the man called out, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Jack stood, his fists clenched. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you. My name is Harris. I work for a private investigative firm." Jack frowned, his confusion deepening. "Why are you following me?" Harris hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been hired to keep an eye on you. To make sure you're safe." "Safe from what?" Jack demanded. "From Richard," Harris said bluntly. Jack's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "Richard's been nothing but generous to me." Harris stepped closer, his expression serious. "Richard's not who you think he is. He has a history of, let's just say, manipulating people like you, offering help only to use them for his own gain." Jack shook his head, refusing to believe it. "You're lying. He doesn't need anything from me. He's a billionaire." Harris sighed. "That's exactly why he does it. He gets bored, Jack. He finds people who are vulnerable, makes them feel like he's saving them, and then, well, let's just say it never ends well for the people he helps. Jack felt a surge of anger. Why should I believe you? You could be making this up. Harris reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stack of photos, handing them to Jack. The images showed Richard with other people, men and women, who looked just like Jack, worn down by life but hopeful in his presence. The last photo in the stack was the most chilling. A woman sitting alone on a park bench, her face hollow with despair. She was one of them, Harris said quietly. Richard promised her the world. She ended up losing everything. Jack stared at the photos, his hands trembling. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was hard to ignore. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. Harris's expression softened. I want you to be careful. Don't let him draw you in too deep. And if you feel like something's off, call me. He handed Jack a card with a phone number on it. Jack nodded, though his mind was a whirlwind of doubt and fear. Harris walked away, leaving Jack alone in the alley with more questions than answers. That evening, Jack returned to the penthouse, determined to confront Richard. As he stepped off the elevator, he noticed something strange. The apartment, usually immaculate, was in disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, and a glass lay shattered near the bar. Richard? Jack called out, his voice echoing through the vast space. There was no answer. Jack moved cautiously through the apartment, his eyes darting to every shadow. When he reached the study, he found Richard sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. Jack, Richard said without looking up. His voice was strained, almost defeated. What happened here? Jack asked, his tone sharp. Richard sighed and leaned back in his chair, his eyes bloodshot. It's nothing. Just business. Jack crossed his arms, his skepticism growing. You don't look like a man who's just dealing with business. Richard's gaze hardened. What are you really asking, Jack? Jack hesitated, the weight of Harris's warning pressing down on him. I met someone today. He said I should be careful about trusting you. Richard's jaw tightened. And you believed him? I don't know what to believe, Jack admitted. But I need to know the truth. Why are you helping me? What do you really want? Richard stood, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. Do you know what it's like to have everything and still feel empty? He asked quietly. Jack didn't answer, unsure where this was going. I help people because it fills a void, Richard continued. Because it reminds me that money isn't the only thing that matters. But sometimes it's not enough. Jack frowned, trying to make sense of Richard's words. What does that mean? Richard turned to face him, his expression unreadable. It means you have a choice, Jack. You can trust me, or you can walk away. But if you choose to stay, you'll have to trust that I have your best interests at heart. Jack felt the tension in the room, the unspoken truths hanging in the air. He wanted to believe Richard, to see him as the savior he appeared to be. But Harris's warning echoed in his mind, a nagging reminder that things might not be as they seemed. As Jack stood there, caught between trust and doubt, he realized that whatever choice he made would change his life forever. Jack stood in the middle of Richard's penthouse, his thoughts tangled in a web of doubt and confusion. Richard's words lingered in his mind, heavy with meaning, but so did Harris's warning. He felt like he was being pulled in two directions, each path shrouded in uncertainty. I need time to think, Jack said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, his face unreadable. Take all the time you need. My offer still stands. Jack left the penthouse that night with a strange mixture of hope and fear. The city felt colder than usual as he walked back to the alley that had become his home. The note from Harris and the conversation with Richard played on a loop in his head, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of something far bigger than himself. The next morning, Jack woke up with a sense of determination. He decided to dig deeper, to find out the truth about Richard before making any decisions. With the card Harris had given him, Jack made a call. Harris answered almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. "Jack, I was hoping you'd call." "I need answers," Jack said bluntly. "If you want me to trust you, you're going to have to prove what you're saying is true." Harris agreed to meet Jack at a small diner on the edge of the city. When Jack arrived, Harris was already there, sitting in a booth with a folder on the table in front of him. He motioned for Jack to sit, his expression serious. "I brought proof," Harris said, sliding the folder across the table. Jack opened it and found pages of documents, photos, and reports. It was a detailed account of Richard's interactions with other people he had helped. The stories all started the same, Richard offering a lifeline to someone in need, but they ended in ruin. Debt, lawsuits, broken promises. Jack's stomach churned as he read through the files. Why would he do this? He asked, his voice shaky. Harris leaned forward, his tone low. Because it's not about helping people. It's about control. Richard thrives on being the one who holds all the power. He gives just enough to make people dependent on him, and then he pulls the rug out from under them. Jack felt a surge of anger and betrayal. He thought back to the way Richard had looked at him, the way he had spoken about second chances. Was it all just an act? But something didn't add up. If that's true, why hasn't anyone stopped him? Jack asked. Harris sighed. Because he's careful. He knows how to cover his tracks. And most of the people he targets don't have the resources to fight back. Jack closed the folder, his hands trembling. What do I do now? That's up to you, Harris said. But if you want my advice, stay away from him. Don't let him pull you into his world. Jack left the diner feeling more lost than ever. He couldn't ignore the evidence Harris had shown him, but part of him still wanted to believe that Richard was different. That maybe, just maybe, he really did want to help. Over the next few days, Jack kept his distance from Richard, using the time to reflect on everything he had learned. He started volunteering at a local shelter, hoping to regain a sense of purpose and give back in a way that felt genuine. The people he met there reminded him of himself struggling but resilient, searching for a way forward. One evening, as Jack was leaving the shelter, he saw a familiar black car parked across the street. Richard stepped out, his expression a mix of concern and relief. I was starting to think I'd never see you again, Richard said. Jack hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I needed time to figure things out. Richard nodded. I understand. But I want you to know that my offer still stands. I believe in you, Jack. Jack studied Richard's face, searching for any hint of deception. He thought about everything Harris had told him, but he also thought about the moments when Richard had seemed sincere. I appreciate what you've done for me, Jack said carefully. But I think I need to find my own way. Richard's expression flickered, but he quickly composed himself. If that's what you want, I respect your decision. But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. Jack nodded and watched as Richard got back into his car and drove away. For the first time in weeks, Jack felt a sense of clarity. He didn't need Richard's help or anyone else's to rebuild his life. In the months that followed, Jack continued volunteering at the shelter and eventually found a job at a local garage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it gave him a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. He never saw Richard again, but he often thought about their brief encounter and the lessons it had taught him. Jack realized that the true value of a second chance wasn't in what someone else could give you. It was in what you could create for yourself. As Jack stood in the garage one evening, wiping grease from his hands, he looked out at the city and smiled. His journey had been far from easy, but it had led him to a place of strength and self-reliance. And for that, he was grateful. The story of Jack and Richard faded into the background of a bustling city, but for Jack, it was a reminder of the power of resilience, the importance of trust, and the enduring hope that even in the darkest times, a better future was always within reach.